right. Well, I am a reader, but I'll try to read in an enthused manner, and I'll try to make it clear what are my words and what are 18th and 19th century words. I hope that's obvious. One of the lessons I've learned in my about 2 decades since graduating with my PhD, mind you, is that there are certain people who will always remain in a position to assign me homework. As the planning for this conference got going, Catherine Braund emailed me to ask if I'd be willing to give a broad overview, not the whole shooting match, in her words, of Bartram's time in East Florida, and she may have even suggested this adventuresome title. So still, what's about to happen is more my fault than hers. I'll note here that while William was implied, she never stated it outright, and I checked the emails to make sure. Another lesson here is don't send me any emails. I've taken the liberty of leaning more heavily on John's writings than I have before. I didn't know much about the subject, but my fear of letting Catherine, not to say the Bartram Trail Conference, down was powerful enough to jar me into action. Not action, but the academic action of going through books and articles and adding just enough primary source material to make it seem like I'd done something akin to research. What follows is not exhaustive by any stretch, but it's the best I could do in a few days, squeezed between teaching, recovering from teaching, and wringing as much out of life as a mild-mannered professor can. The trick is coming up with something new or interesting to say to a room full of people who know the subject matter and the geographic area better than I do. There's a joke that when you're speaking about something, you're the expert in the room, and that is demonstrably false in this case. And by the way, looking ahead at the day's program, things can only go uphill from here. Compared to the entire span of his long life, William Bartram actually spent very little time in Florida. But he encountered Florida and its peoples at 2 crucial points in this life. In the 1760s, still very much in his father's shadow, and during his better-known mid-1770s travels. It's safe to say that Florida exerted an outsized influence on his thinking and writing long after he'd left for Philadelphia. I'll begin by rehashing some of the basics of his sojourns in East Florida, which may be old news to many of you. I want to focus our attention on the 1760s for 2 reasons. First, that period tends to receive relatively short shrift in comparison with William's 1770s journey, which informed the travels more directly. Second, because it appears to me, an admitted novice in this part of this field, that many of the themes that would move William later in life and animate his writing in travels and his correspondence were already apparent in the 1760s. Alongside that, I'll consider some of the wide-ranging effects that his Florida visit had on his later life, and I'll close with what seemed to me like an interesting thought experiment at the time I was writing it. I'll let you be the judge, not to say jury, and certainly not executioner. So William Bartram was physically present in East Florida from late 1765 through much of 1766, again from March to November of 1774, and finally during a 1776 skirmish along the St. Mary's River. In 1765, William's father, John, had recently been appointed botanist to the king. He wrote to his son that June. I received a particular account that our king had appointed me his chief botanist, and I'm ordered to go directly to Florida and have taken passage in a vessel bound to Augustine. He continued, our friend Peter Collinson, an English Quaker and longtime Bartram patron, ordered me to take my son or a servant with me. And as thee wrote to me last winter, and seemed so very desirous to go there, now thee hath a fair opportunity. William leapt at the fair opportunity and joined his father. John was charged with exploring East Florida, one of the prizes won by Great Britain in the recently concluded 7 Years' War. Billy, as he was known well into adulthood, had already garnered attention on both sides of the Atlantic for his observational and artistic skills. In a slightly later letter, Collinson referred to William as, quote, a very ingenious young man with a general knowledge in natural things who would be very assistant in procuring them. To make the decision to follow Collinson's suggestion/order even easier, the younger Bartram had so far failed to settle into any of his father's preferred careers. The pair crossed into Florida in October 1765 and arrived at St. Augustine on the 11th of that month. The following March, John would sail for Charleston and points north, while Billy would remain behind. More on that in a few minutes. During their time together in Florida, William and John dined with the governor and other colonial officials, attended a treaty meeting at Picolata, attempted to find the headwaters of the St. Johns and mistakenly thought they had, chronicled monumental native architecture in the form of mounds, evaluated the land for its agricultural potential, and observed and recorded the plant and animal life of the colony. What was striking to me, revisiting the extant texts about this trip for the first time in years, was the extent to which many of the themes established during these few months would continue to reappear through the younger Bartram's career. While John authored the main document associated with this expedition, he relied, at least in part, on his son's observations in compiling the Diary of a Journey through the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, which he sent to London in spring of 1766, where it was published later that year, contributing to imperially minded Britain's interest in the newly British colony. I recognize for the sticklers out there, this is the third edition, but the first came out in 1766. The background and early stages of the Bartrams' visit to Florida foreshadow a couple of important truths about William's later travels. In the mid and late 18th century, the kind of work the Bartrams set out to do required the support of wealthy patrons, whether private subjects like Collinson or royalty. Second, the Bartrams relied upon well-connected and influential political players. John's letter, quoted above, mentions the governor, James Grant, the subject of the very next speaker. There he is. And Superintendent of Indian Affairs, John Stewart. By the way, my son wanted to go visit a friend in Charleston last weekend and didn't want me around. So we drove together, but then I had hours by myself, and I found John Stewart's house on Trad Street in Charleston. Sounds familiar to some of you, perhaps. The Bartrams dined with Grant the day after they arrived in St. Augustine and would interact closely with Grant and Stewart during their time in East Florida. Bartram's 1770s expeditions would require patronage, in this case the physician John Fothergill, and political savvy as well. By the conclusion of his travels, Bartram was moving through areas very much in dispute between Cherokees, Muskogees, Seminoles, the rebellious colonies, and the British Empire. The Picolata Conference of 1765, or Congress rather, of 1765, will feature prominently in one of the afternoon presentations, and Bartram's interactions with indigenous people will play a large role in the next session, so I'll pre-excuse myself for doing a shoddy job and leave things to the experts. I will point out, though, that one of the things the Picolata Congress provided to William and John was a first-hand, face-to-face encounter with the complicated world of Anglo-indigenous politics and diplomacy, and a potential for these topics to stoke conflict, as the British imagined much of the Southeast to be under their control, at least notionally, while Native people had a different opinion. On a basic level, James Grant and John Stewart invited Muskogee and Seminole representatives to Picolata, formerly a Spanish installation on the St. Johns, to establish diplomatic ties and to agree upon a boundary between British and native lands. In a note appended to his journal of the trip, John described the protocols observed by Muskogee and British leaders, including the elaborate entrance of the Muskogee headmen, dancing, singing, and shouting, and bearing dressed deerskins, pipes, rattles, and eagle feathers, with which two of the Muskogees stroked Grant and Stewart alternately all over their faces and heads. After a couple of days of negotiation, a cession of coastal land was agreed upon and sealed by a ceremonial smoke. Stuart and Grant gifted the native leaders with silver medals, and the British saluted them with drumming and guns. Upon witnessing such a scene, William Bartram could not help but conceive of Florida as a meeting place of diverse peoples, from its lingering traces of Spanish occupation to the recent back and forth between native communities and their New English neighbors. Speaking of native people, John, perhaps at William's urging, the younger Bartram was far more interested in native history and culture than his father. Also made note of several markers of indigenous antiquity in the form of monumental earthworks or mounds. Bartram described Mount Hope as 50 yards long and 30 wide, near 20 foot high, composed of snail and mussel shells. He speculated that the mounds may have served as, quote, common planting grounds of the former Florida Indians, as it is proved by the numerous pieces of broken Indian pots scattered all over these shelly bluffs. Still, Bartram was unable to give native people full credit for their construction, suggesting that a constant wind might have helped the mound reach its current height. Slightly further up the St. Johns, on the banks of Lake George, John christened another mound as Mount Royal. Bartram speculated that this tumulus was part of a larger complex, including planting grounds, burial grounds, and a broad avenue. He questioned what a prodigious multitude of Indians must have labored to raise it. He also hinted at a connection between the funerary practices of the people who built Mount Royal and the present Southern Indians. The Bartrams, especially William later in life, were correct in their willingness to connect America's antiquity with its 18th and 19th century errors, though this assertion placed them among a minority of Euro-Americans who, when they cared to think about such things at all, credited a lost race of mound builders with the construction of these earthworks. This is how Mount Royal appeared in February of this year. I was driving back from a Willie Nelson concert in Florida, and there's a Bartram connection because I was with Tom Halleck, who was a longtime supporter. But anyway, so this is Mount Royal as it appeared in February of this year. And if you ask the gate attendant really nicely, they'll always let you in, I found. It's in a gated subdivision right now by an airport. This is not the rattlesnake, but it is a rattlesnake, and I like this picture better than the other one. So, the Bartrams were also drawn to East Florida as a site ideal for botanizing, observing and reporting on exotic, at least to the English, plant and animal species. Fresh from the Congress, William and his father killed a monstrous rattlesnake and carried it to dinner with the governor. William apparently felt some guilt over the incident, saying, "I tasted of it, but could not swallow it." The 1775 and 1766 travels also yielded descriptions of alligators, an industrious wood rat, and numerous species of birds and fish. Once back at St. Augustine, John packed and shipped more than 250 plant specimens to London, in addition to his cleaned up and expanded diary and a map of the St. Johns. The map of the St. Johns was not solely or even primarily an academic exercise to increase the knowledge of future generations. It was to point out to British investors the spots along the river from which they might derive the most profit. In this sense, John and William were ordered to Florida because it was a new leading edge in Britain's American empire, potentially ripe for agriculture. For both imperial and commercial purposes, as well as natural history purposes, it was important for the Bartrams to travel as far up the St. Johns as they could, making notes about the soil depth, quality, and the like, to inform prospective buyers of the most promising land. By the second week of January, they had reached a point they believed was the headwaters and headed back to the provincial capital at St. Augustine. Now, they were off by many miles, but they had managed to spur interest in colonizing the lands adjacent to the river. While William Bartram was distinctive, perhaps even unique, in his approach to the people and nature of Florida, in one key way, his outlook was very much in keeping with those of other young Anglo-Americans. He and they saw Florida as a place to attempt to make one's fortune. Thus, when John sailed for Philadelphia in early 1766, William remained behind. The story of William Bartram's short and unsuccessful career as a plantation owner has been ably told in other places. Backed by his would-be inheritance and propped up by his father's wealthy friends, including Peter Collinson and Henry Laurens, who oversaw the purchase of enslaved people for William, Bartram tried his hand as a planter. The project had collapsed within a few months, and William signed on with a coastal exploration, and surveying mission before a shipwreck cut it short, and he eventually made his way back to Philadelphia. Though occasionally this fact gets overlooked, I hope this is less true now than it has been, East Florida was also a site of exploitation of black labor. To be fair, so was every single British colony in North America, including William's native Pennsylvania. Latter-day Bartramites also know that William would eventually join the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and pen an eloquent condemnation of the practice of slavery. Have I lingered too long on William and John's 1760s expeditions? Yes. But note how much of William's later thinking and writing followed the framework established when he was in his 20s. He would continue to view Florida as a kind of crossroads of cultures, a meeting place of different peoples, and one that held lessons for intercultural and interracial understanding. In this sense, it could also serve as a kind of microcosm of North America, and eventually a place where a benevolent American republic might flourish without running roughshod over native nations, as Bartram envisioned in Some Hints and Observations Concerning the Civilization of the Indians. He would continue to tout the ancient origins of modern American nations and the deep historical connections of the people to the land. It also primed him to listen carefully to the Muskogee origin story that he recorded about the Okmulgee site. And if we are to give credit to the account the Creeks give of themselves, this place is remarkable for being the first town or settlement when they sat down, as they term it, or established themselves after their immigration from the West. He would return repeatedly in his writings to the abundant plant and animal life of the province, and doing so would help him solidify his reputation as a leading naturalist. Just as one example, his notes on alligator behavior, called into question during his own time and since, have proven more or less accurate in the ensuing centuries. He would not, as we know, continue down the path of plantation ownership and would turn against the practice of slavery forcefully, or as forcefully as we might expect, given what we know about his temperament. He would write in the late 1780s, describing enslavers as, quote, cruel beings, and asserting that black, white, red, and yellow people are equally dear to God. As Henry Laurens, who had built a massive fortune in the slaving business, put it in a letter to John, William was a worthy, ingenious man, but lacking resolution enough to stick it out in the St. John's country as a planter. Maybe resolution and cruelty are interchangeable there. By the time he undertook his own travels to Florida as part of his commission from John Fothergill, William had some idea of what to expect given his experiences in years prior. It's safe to say that while he still viewed Florida as a kind of cultural and political crossroads, made all the more complicated by the burgeoning conflict between Great Britain and its North American colonies, and as ever, a place to be explored in its abundant plant and animal life, documented and cataloged, Bartram's desire to profit from Florida in a direct economic sense had fallen by the wayside, in part because he'd proven really bad at it, but also seemed far better suited for a career in natural history. Now, to be sure, he and his family continued to make money off of their Florida connections, selling seeds and plants from their Philadelphia farm and gardens. It's also fascinating how much overlap there was between locations William visited in the 1760s with his father and on his own in the 1770s. The connections he made in St. Augustine and along the St. Johns River, at plantations and trading houses, smoothed his passage when he came back to East Florida in the 1770s. Spalding's Lower Store served as a kind of home away from home for William, and he branched off from that location to explore points south and west, such as the Alachua Savannah, returning several times for extended stays throughout the summer of 1774. The readers of his travels might get the impression that he traveled alone. Those instances were exceedingly rare. When he engaged native communities, he almost always traveled with somebody who had more experience in Indian country than he did. By the time of William's last brush with Florida, the imperial crisis had made its presence felt up and down the eastern seaboard. William Bartram described his involvement in a letter to Henry Knox. When I was at General McIntosh's on the Altamaha, the English attempted to invade Georgia. Bartram went on to outline a skirmish in which he joined a handful of Georgians attempting to dislodge some British and their native allies from a fortified trading post on the St. Mary's River. At a pivotal point in the battle, one of the native allies, Edward Cashin believed it to be Ahaya or Ahaye, the cowkeeper, stepped out from cover and declared that the Georgians shooting at him were brothers and friends, and that he knew not any cause why they should spill each other's blood, and then walked coolly away from the battle. I don't know if that was cowkeeper or not. Maybe James has an idea, but the skirmish ended indecisively, and the Georgians, Bartram among them, moved away from the contested border. After spending some time in coastal Georgia, William eventually left the southeast for the last time. While William Bartram left Florida in the summer of 1776, never to return, it's safe to say Florida never left him. If you want to think about how crucial Florida was in the shaping of William Bartram's worldview, join me in a little thought experiment. Historians aren't really supposed to play the what-if game, but it seemed appropriate here as long as you don't report me to the authorities. So, what if? What if something prevented John and William from progressing past Charleston or Savannah or Darien in the fall of 1765? The conference at Piccolata still would have happened, of course, but William would not have been there to see Muskogee Anglo diplomacy unfold before his own eyes. Might his ideas about native politics and power have developed differently, absent this early lesson? Florida's early architecture would still exist, of course, and William still would have had an interest in ancient North America, but he wouldn't have been able to compare sites on the coast to sites in the interior, the way he eventually was able to do. If he never tried, and thus never failed, to make money from his plantation on the St. Johns, or tried his hand at owning human beings to exploit their labor, might he have failed to turn against the practice as fully as he did in his later years? Looking ahead in his life, and ahead in the conference program, if he never traveled to Florida in the 1770s, he would never describe the Alachua Savannah, would never meet Ahaye or the cowkeeper, would never receive the name Pukpugee, or the flower hunter or flower seeker. Put simply, William Bartram's time in Florida marked him so deeply that it's impossible to imagine him becoming the kind of writer and the kind of person he became without his adventures as a young man in East Florida. Thank you.